Can you tell us, first of all, Melissa, what Donald Trump is on trial for here in New York City?
Sure. So, in addition to all the things that Katie mentioned, I'm also the co-author with my colleague Andrew Weissman of the Trump Indictments, the historic charging documents with commentary. So we collect all four of the criminal indictments, including this indictment, which has been filed by the Manhattan District Attorney. And it alleges that Donald Trump, in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, falsified business records, which is a misdemeanor crime in New York State. But the additional wrinkle is that apparently, according to Alvin Bragg, he falsified those business records in order to cover up the fact that certain payments were being made by his fixer, Michael Cohen, to adult film star Stormy Daniels, because he believed that this would be bad for him in the 2016 election. So this falsification of business records has been then linked to the commission of these other crimes, election fraud in both the federal level and New York State, and possibly also tax fraud because of the way the payments were made to Michael Cohen to reimburse him for the payments he made to Stormy Daniels. So it's standard fare in New York State. Lots of prosecutors bring these charges for the falsification of business records, but this is really about the cover up of what Alvin Bragg is essentially saying is sort of a kind of precursor to a broader election fraud, keeping this information from the public.
Now, a lot of people, it depends who you're watching. It's fascinating to see how different outlets cover this. And a lot of different people are saying, well, there are two sides. Obviously, this is a serious offense, Melissa. And then there are other people who say this is no big whoop. Yeah. Tell me, in the grand scheme of things, with it connected to election fraud, how serious this is, and if he is convicted, what kind of punishment he could face.
So again, it's a serious thing, but I don't think it is as serious as some of the other crimes that are charged in the three other indictments. So two of the other indictments, the Georgia indictment and the January 6th DC indictment, are about actual election interference in the conduct of the 2020 election, and specifically the effort to preempt the certification of the Electoral College. That's a really big thing. We've never had a situation in the United States where anyone has attempted to impede this peaceful transition of power, which is what is alleged in those two indictments. The Mar-a-Lago documents case is also very serious because it involves the most sensitive classified information. And so, this is national security information that nobody wants floating around, and certainly no one wants it to be kept in a beach house in Palm Beach, which is what Jack Smith alleges in that indictment.
But Melissa, sorry to interrupt, just to play devil's advocate for a quick moment. Now current President Joe Biden also had classified documents in his home in Wilmington. So let's talk about that, and what are the difference between those two instances or situations?
So Andrew and I talk about this in the book. You're exactly right. Mike Pence also had classified information. What seems to be the case there is that those documents seem to have been inadvertently retained. And when they were discovered, the National Archives, which is supposed to be the repository for this kind of information, was immediately notified that there were presidential records that had not been turned over as requested. Some of this was classified information, and they immediately got the authorities involved. That seems to be a big difference in terms of what's been alleged in the Mar-a-Lago indictment, which alleges that not only did Donald Trump willfully retain those materials, when he was asked to return them to the National Archives and to the other places where it was supposed to be retained, he refused to do so. And more importantly, he obstructed the process of returning them by hiding videotapes, destroying videotapes potentially, and moving the documents around so they could not be identified and then returned. So slightly, kind of a big difference in kind. And so you're right. A lot of people may inadvertently find these materials, but it's really what happens after you discover they're in your possession. So again, in the sweep of the four indictments, this indictment, the Manhattan DA's indictment, seems kind of puny, maybe a little small bore in comparison. But I think that's only in comparison to the other crimes that are alleged in those other three indictments. When you get down to the heart of this, it actually is kind of a big deal. Not only is the falsification of business records happening because Michael Cohen, the fixer, is paying off Stormy Daniels to keep her alleged affair with Donald Trump a secret from the electorate during the 2016 election. And this is especially after the Access Hollywood tape emerges in October of 2016. Michael Cohen is also taking out a home equity loan that he is using to reimburse Stormy Daniels, to pay Stormy Daniels. And then he is getting reimbursed from Donald Trump. And because it is being classified as payments for legal services, he's being taxed on that as income. And so Donald Trump is actually paying him a gross up to make him whole because some of this is getting taken out in taxes. So that's kind of the tax fraud part that I think people don't quite appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
As importantly, there is the aptly named David Pecker, as you noted.
Did you hear me say that?
I did. Again, it's a great moniker for him. David Pecker is the CEO of the organization that operates the National Enquirer. And he's involved in this too, because he's the one who solicits Stormy Daniels' story. She believes that he is going to publish this in the National Enquirer, and her story is going to get national attention. And this may be what she wants. But in fact, he is in the business of catching these stories, paying people for their stories,
And
and
it's
then
called
making them
catch and kill.
catch and
Yes.
kill. He pays them, makes them sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then he kills the story. It never runs. And he's doing this at the direction of Donald Trump, it is alleged. And this was part of the story that the prosecution discussed today in their opening statement. This is what they're going, it's like a very concerted effort. And I think when you think about an arm of the media, even if it is the National Enquirer, being conscripted into the service of a political candidate to essentially keep stories that are deleterious to that candidate's chances away from the public, that is a kind of big deal. And we think about the press and the media as being a really important arm in ensuring the transparency of our political process. And so the idea that one branch of the media is in the bag for a particular candidate, perhaps we've become anesthetized to this over the last
Yeah,
couple of years, but
I
it
think
does seem
so.
to be quite
And I
profound.
never really thought of the National Enquirer as the
A
media,
lot of
to be
people
honest
read
with
it.
you.
I
I
mean,
know.
you'd be surprised. A
It
lot of people read it.
it just traffics in such lies
Yeah,
and fabrications. I have been in it throughout my career,
yeah,
and it's just insane the kind of garbage they get away with. And nobody really wants to sue them, although I think a couple of people have. I think Carol
yeah,
Burnett sued them at
yes.
some point, and some other people when what they said was so libelous.
Yeah.
But in general, I think people just want it to go away, and they don't want to bring more attention to a completely bogus story. But getting back to the aptly named David Pecker, did he make some kind of arrangement with the prosecutors where he will not be getting? I should know these legal terms. I'm sorry.
He's a cooperating witness.
Yeah.
So he's offered his testimony, and in exchange, because he's been implicated in this, he's not going to have any liability going forward.
So
So
he's
that
been
is in
granted
exchange for
immunity for everything.
not everything. I'm not quite sure what the scope of the immunity for him is, but at least for this particular case, he's not going to be on the hook. And that is also the case for Michael Cohen, who has been implicated here as well, and has actually already gotten into trouble for efforts related to this scheme with regard to his testimony in Congress and before another federal judge.
So basically, David Pecker started his. He was took the witness stand today. He'll continue tomorrow and probably throughout the rest of the week. What will the prosecution try to show with his testimony, and how will the defense react to that?
So I think it's really interesting to start with David Pecker, because everyone has assumed that the prosecution would start with Michael Cohen, that he is the star witness. But in their opening statements, the prosecution really made clear that their star witness is the evidence, all of the documents showing these various payments. And Michael Cohen has a lot of baggage as a witness, and the prosecution is certainly aware of that. There's going to be lots of room for the defense to impeach his credibility before the jury because of things that he said, inconsistencies in his testimony and other sworn fora. There's lots to say about Michael Cohen as a witness, but the fact that they put David Pecker on makes clear that the prosecution is really interested in corroborating Michael Cohen's story, not necessarily letting Michael Cohen be the star here. So it's going to be the documents, and it's going to be the corroboration from all of these other individuals who are in this sort of orbit around Donald Trump at this time, 2016, right after the Access Hollywood tape came out, and who were involved in what the prosecution is essentially saying was a coordinated scheme to keep this information from the voting public.
Will Stormy Daniels testify?
I think she is supposed to. She's listed here. And again, she is not a witness without some baggage here. And I'm sure the defense will talk about her statements saying how much she dislikes and the antipathy she has for Donald Trump. But she is going to testify. And again, she's going to be part of that effort to corroborate the story that the prosecution is telling about these documents and the role of all of these players in this coordinated
And
scheme.
they have the receipts. I know the New York Times printed them, the checks written by Donald Trump
Yeah.
for
Yes.
$130,000 to Stormy Daniels,
Different
right?
installments, reimbursing Michael Cohen for the payment that he made to Stormy Daniels. And we discussed this in our book. Some of these payments were alleged to have been written while Donald Trump was president and while he was in the Oval
And
Office.
what will the defense claim? That he was protecting his family, that this had nothing to do with politics or tax liabilities?
Well, I mean, the real crime here is the cover up. And so they're basically, their statement is like, you can't connect this entire scheme to Donald Trump. Yes, Donald Trump may have had an affair. Yes, he may have wanted to keep it from his wife. Yes, he may have wanted to keep it from the voting public, but you can't connect what Michael Cohen did and what David Pecker did to Donald Trump himself. He's not the one writing the checks to Stormy Daniels. He's paying Michael Cohen for services rendered, but those might actually be legitimate legal
So are they going to
services.
claim ignorance?
I mean, first of all, they don't have to really claim a lot of anything. The burden here is on the government, the prosecution, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump committed these crimes. So all they really have to do is poke holes. Like, did he have the mental state to commit this crime? Did he know what he was doing was a crime? Like all of this. I mean, it really is. All they have to do is poke holes in this. The rest is really up to Alvin Bragg and his team of prosecutors to prove this to the 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt.
And don't they just need one
They
juror to
just need
say,
one. They
and
just need one.
tell us what will happen if one juror says, he walks away. I mean, that's a hung jury, right?
It's a hung jury, and that's sort of it. You can either, if you have like a mistrial like that, there is a possibility of trying it again. I don't think that that's likely here. So essentially, if one juror holds out here and says, I don't believe the government has met its burden to prove Donald Trump's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on any of these charges, then we're out and we don't have a conviction. There have been 34 charges, like 34 instances of
Yeah.
this. So I mean, there's a lot here. But again, these kinds of trials are won and lost on jury selection. I mean, it's really critically important. And they spent a fair amount of time and a lot of time trying to probe the jury to make sure they had 12 individuals and 6 alternates who could be impartial here.
Somebody asked me, to ask you, will the jury render a verdict on all 34 counts together, or is each single count rendered its own verdict?
I think we'll find out more when we see the jury instructions, how the court instructs the jury to think about this, whether it's sort of en masse or individually. I've seen it done in different ways. So I think we'll wait to see how that happens. And that happens usually toward the end of the trial.
And what is the punishment if he's convicted?
So it's not as big as it is in some of the other indictments. So it's probably around 4 years. It may not, like 4 years incarceration. And that's really at the top end. It doesn't have to be incarceration at all. It could just be a significant fine.
Oh, so I guess that's at the discretion of the judge?
The judge is the person who sentences Donald Trump ultimately if he is convicted.
And Melissa, before we go, because I know people are busy, tell us quickly about the opening statements, what the prosecution did, what the defense did, because that in many ways has set the tone for the rest of the trial.
So the prosecution did some really important things, and some of it you could sort of see where they were going even at jury selection. So one of the questions that I thought was really interesting at jury selection was the prosecution asked some of the prospective jurors whether they could understand in, for example, killing for hire situation, that the person pulling the trigger is, yes, technically the killer, but it is the person paying the assassin to do the killing who's actually part of the scheme as well. And I think that was setting up to find out whether the jury could appreciate that, although Michael Cohen and David Pecker are the ones interacting with Stormy Daniels and paying her off or securing her story, it is all being done at the behest of Donald Trump. He's, to put it the Taylor Swift way, he's the mastermind behind this. And they wanted to make sure the jury could disaggregate that and sift that out. And so you saw that coming out in the opening statement from the prosecution today. Like, this is a scheme with Donald Trump at the top, orchestrating it all for the purpose of keeping this information from the electorate, especially in light of the Access Hollywood tape, which came out in October of 2016, so that he could optimize his chances to be elected in November 2016. So it's really about kind of the cover up. Like, he did this and then he covered it all up by having these payments go through Michael Cohen, and then he reimburses Michael Cohen, and then David Pecker is there to get these stories and to keep them from the public. And Donald Trump is at the center of all of it.
Any risk in comparing what Trump did to actually killing someone?
I think this was during jury selection. It didn't come out in the opening statement, which would have been highly prejudicial, obviously. But I think the point of it was, can you understand that there may be situations where someone else is actually doing the act that we find objectionable, but it is at the behest of this other person? That other person isn't off the hook. That other person is part of this. And just to sort of make that clear.
And in the opening statement for the prosecution, what was their main thrust? That Donald Trump did this even though he wasn't directly involved?
Yeah.
Or what was it? Because they did a good job kind of telling a story, didn't they?
No,
from
they
all
did
accounts?
tell. I mean, trial work is storytelling, and certainly, Donald Trump is falling asleep here, so imagine how the jury must feel. So they have to keep this jury really engaged, and so they told a story that, it's full of intrigue. It's the eve of an election, this salacious tape comes out, and this is a guy who doesn't want his wife to know about it, but really doesn't want the electorate to know about it. And so he gets his fixer, Michael Cohen, to work with someone else with whom he's very close, the aptly named David Pecker, and they're going to work together to catch the story, to kill it, to pay off this woman and keep her quiet until the election is over.
One thing I wanted to mention, did they talk about how this wasn't the first time with Susan McDougal, right? Was that
Karen McDougal? Karen McDougal.
Karen McDougal.
Susan
Sorry, different.
McDougal is different president.
I was going to say that was a different president many years ago. But Karen McDougal, the same thing happened, right? They paid her off.
That's going to come in too. That's going to come in too. Karen McDougal's situation, and it's very similar to what is being alleged with regard to Stormy Daniels, but it falls outside of the statute of limitations. It's too old to actually be charged as a crime, but it can be corroboration, sort of a pattern and practice of doing this in order to keep this information away from those who might think differently of Donald Trump if they knew about it.
Will she testify as well?
She might. Hope Hicks may testify. Kellyanne Conway may testify. The list is pretty long.
And finally, the defense's opening statement. Talk about what they tried to convey to the jury.
Yeah. Basically, they are arguing that this entire case is built on the uneven foundation of Michael Cohen's word. And Michael Cohen is a known and proven liar. And why would we ever believe him? Why would we ever put our faith in something that Michael Cohen said? And again, all they have to do is introduce reasonable doubt, right? They don't have to do anything more than poke some holes in the prosecution's case. And Michael Cohen is a hole. He is a black hole of perjury, and they made that very clear.
And what about Donald Trump? Will he testify on his own behalf?
Well, interestingly, we had what are known as Sandoval hearings today in court. And a Sandoval hearing is a hearing that you have to have if the defendant is going to take the stand, so you can sort of talk about what can be introduced and what can, and sort of protect the defendant's rights, give him an opportunity to know what's going to be presented against him. So we had that hearing in part because Donald Trump has made clear that he wants to testify. I don't know if he is going to testify, because part of the ruling on the Sandoval material was that Donald Trump's statements from the earlier civil trials, so the fraud trial that Letitia James brought against him, the E. Jean Carroll trial, all of that, those civil statements from those civil trials can be brought in here and can be used to impeach Donald Trump as a witness. That's really significant. And I imagine after that hearing, you have a defense bar, the three lawyers who are representing Donald Trump, who are probably not really eager to have their client take the stand.
But if he wants to and insists, they'll have to let him, right?
It is his right to do so, but it's also his prerogative and right not to. And again, most defendants, because they don't actually have to prove their innocence, they just need to prove that there are holes in the prosecution's case, don't wind up taking the stand, because the risks are really high. You can impeach yourself, you can present information that's inconsistent with earlier statements that you've made, and you can make yourself look like a liar in front of the jury and really damage your credibility.
And before we go, the other three trials, the Georgia trial, we haven't heard much about that with Fonnie Willis. Boy, I can't believe that happened, by the way.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate and unforced error. That was a case
You
I think was
think? You
like
think? I mean, what?
yeah. I mean, again, I just let me emphasize this because I think Fonnie Willis has gotten a bad rap, and I think the optics of this were poor. But typically, when we worry about ethical problems with regard to the prosecution, it's really that the prosecutor is dating a juror or a witness or the judge or a member of the defense team. The fact that the prosecutor is dating someone on her own team, that really doesn't raise ethical charges. But obviously, the optics are poor. The fact that he was hired. And maybe his expertise is more spare than perhaps we would like under those circumstances, and then they're going on these trips. It's just an optics thing. And we should also recognize that there had been an effort even before these ethics questions were raised to limit Fonnie Willis's prosecutorial authority in this case by a coordinated effort of the Republican prosecutors in Georgia to limit her. So, I mean, she's kind of been a target the whole time, which, makes, I think, again, an unforced error in many ways. But I think the reason why she has been the focus of so many of these efforts to sort of limit her authority or take her down entirely is because she's really good at prosecuting RICO cases in Georgia. She's offered a really strong case with lots of defendants. There are 19 defendants here, 18 in addition to Donald Trump. She already had some of those defendants pleading out, becoming cooperating witnesses for the prosecution. And this is a trial where if Donald Trump is ultimately convicted, even if he becomes president, he cannot pardon himself or otherwise shut this down.
And okay, and will all these trials happen before the election?
No. So this Thursday, Katie, watch the Supreme Court. There's going to be a live oral argument on Thursday in the Supreme Court on the immunity issue that came up in the context of Jack Smith's January 6th election interference case. It's also an issue likely in the Mar-a-Lago case. And the question is whether or not a president can be completely immune from criminal liability for any crimes that he undertakes. And I think it's pretty clear that the Supreme Court is not going to say that the president isn't a king. I think the Supreme Court's going to say, like, the president cannot be criminally immune, or at least not entirely. But here's the thing. The court had this case in February. They were given an opportunity to get in here and decide this question back in December when Jack Smith asked them to bypass the intermediate appellate court and just decide this question so the trial could go forward. They declined to review it at that point. They let it go to the DC Circuit. The DC Circuit took about a month to write a very methodical and comprehensive opinion, essentially saying Donald Trump is not a king. He can be criminally liable. The Supreme Court then decided to review this case, and they slated it for the absolute last day they were hearing oral arguments this year. So it's going to be heard on April 25th, the absolute drop dead date for this court. And unless the court issues an opinion on April 26th or the first week of May, I think it's very unlikely that we're actually going to get a trial in the January 6th election interference case. I think the court is ultimately going to say Donald Trump cannot be criminally immune, but if they don't do it quickly, they will have effectively given him immunity in this case because they will have prevented the January 6th trial from actually happening.
You don't think they'll feel pressure obviously heretofore they haven't, Melissa, but do you think as time moves on that they'll feel any kind of urgency?
I'm waiting to see what happens on Thursday. I'll be watching oral argument, and everyone can watch supremecourt.gov, supremecourtus.gov, and they'll be live streamed there, and you can listen along. But, I do think that there are individuals on the court who may be taking their time on this for lots of different reasons. Interestingly, the day the court agreed that it would take up this case and review it, it was also just after the court had issued its opinion in Trump versus Anderson. That was the disqualification case about whether Colorado could disqualify Trump from the ballot. That was ostensibly a unanimous decision, 9-0, but there was a really interesting 3-person concurrence by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson. And in that 3-person concurrence, they really chided the majority for going too far, deciding an issue about the 14th Amendment and the the disqualification clause that it didn't need to do. And in that concurrence, they noted that this was essentially immunizing, quote unquote, an oath breaking insurrectionist, Donald Trump, ostensibly. And they referred to him as an oath breaking insurrectionist 4 times. And they essentially said that the court, the majority, was sequestering this issue and this defendant for its own uses and for the benefit of this defendant. I have never seen a writing as sharp and as pointed and essentially saying to the world, our colleagues are in the bag for this guy.
So do you think do you think they're influenced by that or not really? I mean,
I don't know. They have a 6-3 conservative supermajority. They don't have to be influenced by anyone, as we've seen in their efforts to roll back a lot of cases, longstanding precedents. You can do whatever you want when you have a 6-3 conservative supermajority.
Oh, sorry, I'm keeping you. And I know your son's under the weather. Tell him I hope he feels better. But January, so you're talking about January 6th. So that's going to delay that. What about the Georgia trial and the classified documents trial?
So Georgia seems to be in a lull. They're appealing, like Judge McAfee, who heard the ethics complaint against Fani Willis, said that there was no ethics problem, although he issued a very stern rebuke to both Fani Willis and Nathan Wade and demanded that one of them get off the case. And Nathan Wade got off the case, and Fani Willis is still there. That's going to be appealed. His ruling is going to be appealed. And I think the real question is Fani Willis, is she going to be allowed to stay on that case? If she isn't, if she has to be removed, her whole team has to be removed. And it's up to an administrative board of prosecutors in Georgia to name a new prosecutor. Very difficult to do given the kind of expertise that's required. There's already another case from which Fani Willis was taken off because of her ties to one of the parties, and they still haven't found a prosecutor to prosecute that case. So that's essentially in a kind of long-standing state of abeyance. The Mar-a-Lago case seems to be in a state of deferment that is almost entirely the product of the judge, Eileen Cannon. And it really is sort of surprising because it's a pretty straightforward case. The law is basically that you have these documents, you're not supposed to have them, you haven't returned them, and you kept them, and then you tried to move them around so they could not be returned. It couldn't be more straightforward. We have tons of people sitting in federal penitentiaries who have had far less classified material in their possession. There are some complications because some of the evidence here is classified information, so it has to go through the Classified Informations Procedures Act, CIPA, and that can be complicated. But for the most part, it seems that the delays here are really the product of Judge Cannon herself.
Yeah. A Trump appointee, right, who has made some pretty strange moves.
She's been rebuked a couple of times by the Intermediate Appellate Court above her, the 11th Circuit. But I also think, to be generous to her, she's also a judge with not a lot of criminal trial experience. Right. So this is a complicated trial to some degree, even though the nature of the law is really straightforward. So it could be that, or it could be that, she's there to play for her guy. And, we just don't know what it is.
Well, Melissa Murray, this is super helpful. Thank you so much. I'd love to do this again. Great to see you. And
UVA all the way, Katie.
Wahoo, baby. 2 UVA ladies here, people.
That's us.